The 1937 Ostend Air Disaster stands as one of the most savage tragedies in European royal history. In a single foggy afternoon, the family of hereditary Grand Duke Georg Donatus of Hesse and his wife Princess Cecilia, sister of Prince Philip, was almost entirely extinguished in a ball of fire. Their story encapsulates love, duty, and political compromise, culminating in a twist of fate so cruel it seemed like the fulfillment of a generations-old curse. That curse was not mere folklore. It was a documented history of grief etched into the very fabric of their family tree, beginning with Georg Donatus's own grandmother, Princess Alice. As the daughter of Great Britain's Queen Victoria, Alice's marriage into the House of Hesse was meant to cement a dynastic bond. Instead, it seemed to import a legacy of tragedy. The first shadow fell with her young son, Prince Friedrich, affectionately known as Friddy. A lively boy, he suffered from hemophilia, the royal disease passed down from Queen Victoria. In 1873, in a horrifyingly mundane accident, he fell from a window in the palace. A healthy child might have survived with broken bones, but for Friddy, the internal bleeding could not be stopped. He died hours later in his mother's arms. But fate's cruelest test for Princess Alice was yet to come. In the winter of 1878, diphtheria, the terrifying plague of the 19th century, swept through the palace in Darmstadt. One by one, her children fell ill, as did her husband, Louis IV. Alice nursed them all with tireless devotion, a bastion of maternal strength in a home filled with sickness. Her youngest daughter, Marie, succumbed to the disease. Overcome with grief, Alice tried to console her only surviving son, 10-year-old Ernest Louis. Forgetting all caution in her sorrow, she kissed him. It was a fatal act of love. Days later, Alice herself fell ill with diphtheria. Her body weakened from weeks of stress and exhaustion. She died on the 17th anniversary of her own father's death, leaving her children, including young Ernest, orphaned and their house forever marked by sorrow. The curse, however, did not die with Alice. It metastasized, following her daughters to the far corners of Europe. Two of them had married into the Russian imperial family, a connection that would lead them to one of history's most infamous massacres. The younger, Alex, became Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. Her story is one of epic collapse, a tragic reign that ended in a dusty basement in Ekaterinburg, where she, her husband, and their 5 children were brutally executed by a Bolshevik firing squad. Her older sister, Elisabeth, met an equally horrific, though less famous end. After her husband was assassinated by a revolutionary's bomb, she forsook worldly life and became a deeply devout nun, founding a convent in Moscow. But her piety offered no protection from the Red Terror. In 1918, she was arrested by the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, and herded with other Romanov relatives to a mine shaft in the Ural Mountains. There, she was beaten and thrown, still alive, into the pit. The Bolsheviks tossed grenades in after them, sealing their fates. It was this visceral personal connection to the horrors of communism that would later haunt her nephew, Georg Donatus, and influence the most controversial decision of his life. The Hesse family did not just read about the revolution. They had lost 2 entire branches of their family to it. To understand the weight of this catastrophe, we must look at its central figures. At the heart of this generational sorrow stood one man, Grand Duke Ernest Louis, the father of Georg Donatus. To understand the son, one must first understand the father, a man who seemed to spend his entire life building walls of beauty to keep out the encroaching darkness of his past. Ernest was the boy who had survived the diphtheria outbreak that killed his mother and sister. He was the man who had to process the news that his two beloved sisters in Russia had been savagely murdered. He was the great survivor, and his life was a testament to the struggle of carrying on in the face of unimaginable loss. His early adulthood was marked by yet another personal catastrophe, a disastrous marriage to his first cousin, Princess Victoria Melita of Edinburgh, known as Ducky. Forced together for dynastic reasons, they were a terrible mismatch. Ernest was sensitive and artistic. Ducky was vivacious and demanding. Their union was loveless, and their divorce in 1901 caused a scandal that reverberated through the royal courts of Europe. From this unhappy marriage came a single beautiful daughter, Princess Elizabeth, whom Ernest adored. She was the light of his life, a promise of happiness. But the curse was not finished. In 1903, while the family was visiting the Tsar in Poland, the 8-year-old princess suddenly fell ill and died within a day from typhoid fever. For Ernest Lewis, it was the ultimate cruelty. The one source of joy from his darkest years had been snatched away. It would have been easy to succumb to despair, but instead, Ernest Louis dedicated himself to rebuilding. He married again, this time for love, to Princess Eleanor of Solms-Hohensolms-Lich. With Eleanor, he finally found the domestic peace he had always craved. Together they had 2 sons, Georg Donatus in 1906 and Louis in 1908. At Wolfsgarten, he poured his soul into creating a sanctuary, not just for his new family, but for art itself. He became one of the great patrons of the Jugendstil, or Art Nouveau, movement, establishing the Darmstadt Artists Colony. He turned his city into a beacon of modern design, a place where beauty and creativity could flourish. It was as if he believed that if he could create enough light, he could finally banish the long shadows of his family's past. This was the world Georg Donatus was born into, a fragile paradise built on a foundation of immense sorrow. Georg Donatus was the heir to a throne that no longer existed. He grew up in a defeated Germany after World War I, where royal titles were merely symbolic. His family was also haunted by a curse of tragic deaths, spanning generations, which shaped him into a serious and dutiful man. Princess Cecilia of Greece and Denmark, however, had an entirely opposite childhood, one of chaos and exile. Her family was driven from their homeland, forced to live adrift as she witnessed her own mother's devastating mental breakdown. These very hardships forged her into a strong and captivating woman. They found each other like a perfect match, building a happy family at Wolfsgarten Palace with their 3 beautiful children, Prince Ludwig, Prince Alexander, and Princess Johanna. For a brief time, it seemed the Hesse family curse had finally been broken, but beyond their walls, a darkness was rising, Hitler's Germany. Under social pressure and a deep-seated fear of communism, which had claimed their Romanov relatives, Georg Donatus and Cecilia made a fateful decision. In May 1937, they, along with his younger brother Louis and his fiancée, formally joined the Nazi Party. This remains the most difficult and controversial chapter in their story. To comprehend their choice, one must step into the bewildering and desperate world of the German aristocracy in the 1930s. The Germany that Georg Donatus grew up in was a nation traumatized and humiliated. The defeat in World War I had not just ended a war, it had shattered an empire. In 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and with him, centuries of monarchy collapsed. Suddenly, princes and dukes who had ruled for generations were rendered powerless, their titles merely symbolic courtesies in the new chaotic Weimar Republic. They were a class adrift, stripped of their political purpose and social standing. The economic turmoil that followed was catastrophic. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s saw fortunes evaporate overnight, Life savings became worthless. This instability bred a deep-seated fear and a profound longing for the order and certainty of the old days. Into this vacuum of power and purpose stepped Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. To a dispossessed aristocracy, the Nazis made a seductive, multifaceted appeal. They were a bulwark against the existential threat of communism, the very ideology that had brutally murdered their own relatives in Russia. They promised to restore national pride, to rebuild the military, and to crush the political chaos that threatened to tear the nation apart. For many German nobles, joining the party became a pragmatic, if morally fraught, decision. It was a way to signal allegiance to the new power, to protect their lands and wealth from potential confiscation, and to find a new role in a rapidly changing world. Georg Donatus and his brother were not alone. Other prominent royals, like Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, a son of the former Kaiser, became enthusiastic and high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. In the toxic social ecosystem of the 1930s, aligning with the Nazis was, for many in their class, seen as a patriotic duty, a devil's bargain made in the name of securing Germany's future and their own. What could possibly motivate this handsome young couple, relatives of the British royal family, to align themselves with one of history's most monstrous regimes? The answer is likely a complex and deeply uncomfortable mixture of pragmatism, ideology, and social pressure. First, there was the motive of survival and self-preservation. As prominent landowners with vast estates, they were vulnerable. The Nazi state had the power to confiscate property and ruin families who were deemed politically unreliable. For a throneless royal house whose status was now intrinsically linked to their wealth and property, joining the party was a form of insurance, a public declaration of loyalty designed to protect their family and their inheritance. Second, there was the powerful and deeply personal motive of anti-communism. The horrific fate of their aunts and cousins in Russia was not an abstract political event for them. It was a visceral family trauma. The Nazis were, in their public pronouncements, the most powerful anti-communist force in Europe. For a family that had seen firsthand what a Bolshevik revolution entailed, this would have been a powerful and persuasive argument. Third, there was the influence of their social circle. Princess Cecilia, in particular, was known to be acquainted with Hermann Göring. Being seen at official functions and joining the party was, for many in their class, simply what was expected. It was the path of least resistance, a way to maintain their position in the new social and political landscape of Germany. It is a decision that is impossible to defend in the clear light of historical hindsight. But in the murky, terrifying context of Germany in 1937, their choice was tragically not an uncommon one for people of their class. They were part of a generation of German elites who made a devil's bargain, hoping to preserve their world, only to find themselves complicit in its ultimate moral collapse. One can only imagine what the aging Grand Duke Ernest Louis thought of all this. A man who had fought against the tide of Prussian militarism his whole life, who cherished his English heritage and his liberal, artistic values. To see his own sons, the future of his house, donning the swastika must have been a source of profound private anguish. It was another tragedy to add to his long list, a sign that the dark and violent world he had always tried to keep at bay had finally breached the walls of his own home. By the autumn of 1937, Georg Donatus and Cecilia were living a life of stark contradiction. In private, they were the heart of a happy, loving, and beautiful young family, the very picture of domestic bliss at their idyllic country home. In public, they had just thrown their lot in with a brutal, totalitarian regime that was leading their country and the world towards a catastrophic war. Their personal sunlit island was now surrounded by an ocean of encroaching darkness, a shadow that was about to consume them. The final chain of events would begin not with a political storm, but with an intimate family sorrow. In the autumn of 1937, the long shadows that had haunted the House of Hesse gathered once more for its patriarch as Grand Duke Ernest Louis. A man who had survived a lifetime of grief was finally dying. For weeks, his family had kept a vigil by his bedside. His devoted wife, Eleanor, rarely left his side. His two sons, Georg, Donatus, and Louis, were a constant presence, along with his beautiful daughter-in-law, Cecilia. The old Grand Duke, who had been diagnosed with cancer, was fading, but his final days were spent not in the cold formality of a royal court, but in the warm embrace of the family he had so lovingly rebuilt. This was a moment of profound transition. Ernest Louis was the last of a generation, one of the few remaining German rulers who had come to the throne before the Great War. His death would not just be a family affair, it would be the end of an era for Hesse and for the intertwined royal families of Europe. The mantle of leadership for the ancient house was now passing to his eldest son. One can only imagine the final conversations between the dying father and his heir. Ernest Louis, the sensitive artist, the product of the 19th century, who had championed internationalism in the arts, was handing the future of his dynasty to Georg Donatus, the dutiful, pragmatic son who had just a few months earlier sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Did the old Grand Duke voice his fears for the dark path Germany was on? Did he offer his son words of caution? Or did he simply find solace in the fact that his line was secure and that his beloved family was united? History does not record the details, but the weight of that moment, the passing of a lost world into the hands of a generation destined for a new and terrible war, is immense. On October 9th, 1937, with his family around him, Ernest Louis, the last Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, died peacefully. He was 68 years old. The funeral of Ernest Louis was a remarkable and surreal event. It was the last great gathering of European royalty on German soil before the Second World War would turn them all into bitter enemies. It was a testament to the deep personal affection and respect in which Ernie, the quiet artist prince, was held by his relatives across the continent. They navigated the increasingly tense and hostile political landscape of Nazi Germany to pay their last respects to a man who represented a world that was rapidly vanishing. The list of mourners was a snapshot of a dying order. Lord Louis Mountbatten, representing the British royal family, came to mourn the man who was both his cousin and his brother-in-law. Prince Philip's father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, was there. The Duke of Windsor, who less than a year earlier had been King Edward VIII of Great Britain, made the journey from his new exile in Paris, and representing the new order of Germany was Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, a son of the exiled Kaiser, now a high-ranking officer in the Nazi SA. The funeral procession in Darmstadt was a somber, magnificent affair. The streets were lined with thousands of local people, the ordinary citizens of Hesse, who had genuinely loved their last ruler. They came to mourn the man who had been their patron and protector, the man who had turned their city into a beacon of modern art. The visual spectacle was profoundly jarring. The ancient banners of the House of Hesse, bearing its colorful lion, mingled in the crowd with the stark black swastikas of the new regime which Georg Donatus and his brother, as Nazi party members, were now obliged to display. It was a perfect, chilling encapsulation of the contradictions of the era, a funeral for a 19th century prince, hosted by his 20th century Nazi sons. As Ernest Lewis's coffin was laid to rest in the family mausoleum in the beautiful Rosenhohe Park, it truly seemed as if a long, tragic story had finally found its peaceful end. The family, though grieving, was united. The future of the house was secure in the hands of the capable Georg Donatus, and now their focus could turn from mourning to a joyous celebration that promised a new and happy beginning. The cause for that celebration was the upcoming wedding of the Grand Duke's younger son, Prince Louis. He was engaged to the Honorable Margaret Geddes, the daughter of Sir Auckland Geddes, a prominent British diplomat and academic. The match was a brilliant one, a love story that once again reinforced the deep personal ties between the Hessian family and Great Britain, a connection that must have seemed increasingly important and perhaps even politically useful as the relationship between Britain and Nazi Germany deteriorated. The wedding was originally planned for October in London, but it had been postponed when Ernest Lewis's health took a turn for the worse. With his passing, the question of when to hold the ceremony became a delicate matter. After some discussion, it was decided that a larger celebration would be held on November 20th, but a small private civil ceremony would take place on the 17th, as soon as the family could travel to London after the main period of mourning had passed. The mood in both London and Darmstadt began to lift. In London, the bride and her family, along with the groom, Prince Louis, finalized the preparations. In Darmstadt, the Hessian family, led by Georg Donatus, prepared for the journey. It would be a welcome change of scene, a chance to leave the grief of the funeral behind, and celebrate the happy future of the family's beloved younger son. The journey was not just a trip, it was a symbol of the family moving forward, a testament to their resilience in the face of yet another loss. The plan was simple. The core of the family would fly from Frankfurt to London on a modern Sabena Airlines aircraft on November 16th, the day before the private ceremony. This would give them time to rest and prepare for the wedding. Everything was meticulously arranged. There was no sense of foreboding, no premonition of the horror that was to come. There was only the quiet, sad reflection on a father lost, and the happy anticipation of a brother's new life. On the cold, crisp morning of November 16, 1937, the heart of the House of Hesse gathered at the airfield in Frankfurt. The aircraft waiting for them on the tarmac was a Junkers Jew 52, a German-built triple-engine airliner known for its ruggedness and reliability. It was the workhorse of many European airlines, a plane with an excellent safety record. There was no reason for anyone to feel apprehensive. It was a routine flight. The passenger list for that flight reads like a roll call for a tragedy. First aboard was the family's new matriarch, the 58-year-old Dowager Grand Duchess Eleanor. Still dressed in mourning for the husband she had loved for over 30 years, she was making the journey for her son Louis to give him her blessing on his wedding day. Then came her eldest son, Georg Donatus, the new 31-year-old head of the house. He was the serious, dutiful heir, now carrying the full weight of his family's long and tragic history on his shoulders. With him was his vibrant and beautiful wife, the 26-year-old Princess Cecilia of Greece and Denmark. She was a picture of glowing health, but she was also heavily pregnant, just 3 weeks away from delivering their fourth child. She was particularly excited for the trip, looking forward to seeing her family, including her younger brother, the 16-year-old Prince Philip, who was now a cadet at Gordonstoun School in Scotland and would be an usher at the wedding. And then came the children, the future of the dynasty. 6-year-old Prince Ludwig and 4-year-old Prince Alexander dressed in their smart little traveling coats, their faces likely full of the innocent excitement of an airplane adventure. In a seemingly small, inconsequential decision that would echo through history, Georg Donatus and Cecilia had decided to leave their youngest child, their 1-year-old daughter, Princess Johanna, at home at Schloss Wolfsgarten with her nanny. She was simply too young, they reasoned, for the long journey and the excitement of a London wedding. It was a practical decision, an act of parental love and common sense. It was also an act that would, through the cruelest twist of fate, make her the sole temporary survivor of her entire immediate family. The narrator can only reflect on the terrible randomness of it all, how the smallest, most logical choices can have the largest, most heartbreaking consequences. With the family were their companions, the children's nurse and a close family friend. The aircraft doors were sealed. The 3 engines of the Junkers roared to life. The plane taxied down the runway and lifted off into the clear German sky, banking west towards Brussels and then London. The mood on board was likely one of quiet reflection, mixed with the happy anticipation of the joyous event that awaited them. They were a family in mourning, but also a family on the cusp of a celebration, flying from Germany, deep in the shadow of the swastika, towards the liberal democracy of Great Britain, a journey that perfectly mirrored their own divided heritage. In London, the wedding preparations were complete. The church was decorated. The guests were ready. The groom, Prince Louis, was waiting at Croydon Airport. Everything was perfectly in place for either a happy family reunion or an unspeakable catastrophe. The plane flew on, a silver speck in the vast autumn sky, heading directly into the thick, waiting bank of fog that would, in just a few short hours, swallow them whole. As the Junkers Ju-52 crossed the Belgian coast and began its approach to its scheduled stopover at Steen Airport in Ostend, the weather deteriorated with terrifying speed. A thick, wet, impenetrable fog, a notorious peril of the North Sea in autumn, rolled in from the sea, blanketing the landscape in a disorienting gray gloom. From the cockpit, visibility dropped from miles to mere meters in a matter of minutes. The ground, the runway, the entire world outside their windows had simply disappeared. The pilot, a seasoned aviator named Antoine Lambeau, was now in an incredibly difficult position. Air traffic control and radio navigation aids in 1937 were primitive. He was flying largely by instruments, instinct, and dead reckoning. He circled the airfield, a ghost in the fog, searching for a break in the clouds that would allow him a glimpse of the runway. But no break came. The pressure on him must have been immense. His passengers were high-ranking European royalty, on a tight schedule to get to a wedding in London. Turning back or diverting to another airport would have been the safer option, but it would also have been a major disruption. After circling for some time, hoping for an improvement that never came, and with his fuel supply dwindling, Captain Lambeau made the fatal decision. He would attempt a landing. He began his descent, a slow, careful procedure, flying blind through the soupy gray void. No one on board would have known the extreme danger they were in until the final, terrifying second. On the ground, workers at a brick factory on the outskirts of Ostend heard the sound of the Junkers' 3 engines roaring unnervingly low overhead, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once in the thick fog. The plane was off course, too low, drifting dangerously towards the industrial zone. Suddenly, a shape loomed directly in the aircraft's path. It was the tall brick chimney of the factory. There was a horrific tearing sound as the left wing of the airliner sliced into the chimney. The impact instantly ripped the wing and the portside engine from the fuselage. The plane, its aerodynamic stability destroyed and its fuel tanks torn open, immediately inverted, becoming a tumbling, flaming coffin, and plunged the final few hundred feet to the earth. The aircraft crashed directly into the roof of the factory it had just struck. The full load of aviation fuel ignited and the plane exploded in a massive fireball that was seen for miles around, a brief, horrific sun in the gray gloom. The entire structure was engulfed in flames. Everyone on board, the entire Hessian royal family, their companions, and the plane's crew, was killed instantly. The scene that greeted the first responders was apocalyptic. The wreckage was a twisted, burning pyre, the fire so intense that it took hours to extinguish. The factory roof had collapsed and the smoldering remains of the aircraft lay amidst the rubble. One by one, the bodies of the passengers and crew were recovered from the wreckage. They were so badly burned that they were almost unidentifiable. They were laid out in a row on the factory floor, a silent, horrific testament to the inferno. And it was there, amidst the smoldering debris, that the rescue workers made a final, almost unbearably tragic discovery, a detail so nightmarish it seems to belong to fiction. Lying in the wreckage was the body of a tiny, premature baby boy. The sheer force and trauma of the crash had induced labor in the final moments of Princess Cecilia's life. In the midst of the fire and the fall, as her world was literally torn apart, she had given birth to her fourth child. The infant, the boy who was to be the future of the House of Hesse, had been born and had died in the same terrifying instant. He had taken his first and last breath in a world of fire and chaos. In London, the wedding guests were gathered. Prince Louis waited at the airport. The hours ticked by with no word. The initial reports were confused, just a wire service dispatch about a Sabina plane down in Belgium. Then, the terrible confirmation came through a phone call. The flight was his family's. There were no survivors. In a single horrifying moment, Louis's world was annihilated. His mother, his revered brother, his beloved pregnant sister-in-law, and his two young nephews were all gone. He had gone to the airport to greet his family and begin his new life as a married man. Instead, he was met with the crushing, incomprehensible reality that he was now the last adult male of his direct line. The grand wedding, scheduled for the next day, was canceled. Instead, a small private ceremony was held in its place, a somber and heartbreaking affair overshadowed by the almost unbelievable scale of the tragedy. The bride and groom were dressed in black. Just a few days later, a grief-stricken Prince Louis and his new wife, Margaret, had to make the agonizing journey to Darmstadt, accompanying the 5 coffins of their lost family. For the second time in just over a month, the royal houses of Europe gathered at the Rosenhöhe, the family's beautiful burial ground. This time, the mood was not one of respectful sorrow for a long life ended, but of raw, uncomprehending horror. A 16-year-old Prince Philip, summoned from his strict boarding school in Scotland, was there. Photographs from the day show him walking, stony-faced and impossibly young, in the funeral procession for his beloved sister Cecilia, her husband, and their 2 little boys. He was forced to confront a level of tragedy that would shape the rest of his life. They all watched as the coffins, 2 of them heartbreakingly small, were carried into the same mausoleum where they had laid Ernest Louis to rest only weeks before. The sight was a stark, brutal image of unimaginable loss. The curse of the House of Hesse had delivered its final, most devastating blow, or so it seemed. In the midst of the almost total devastation, there was one tiny, flickering ember of hope. The orphan princess, 1-year-old Johanna, had survived, safe at home in Wolfsgarten, spared by that seemingly small practical decision to leave her behind. Prince Louis and his new wife Margaret legally adopted the little girl. She was their only niece, the last living descendant of Georg Donatus and Cecilia, a precious link to the family they had lost. She became the center of their world, a beautiful, happy child who, for a time, filled the silent halls of the palace with joy. She was a symbol of hope, a reason to look to the future, a sign that perhaps even after so much darkness, life could go on. But the curse of the House of Hesse, it seemed, was not yet finished with its work. It was a curse that demanded absolute completion. In 1939, just as the world was about to be plunged into another great war, the little girl, not yet 3 years old, suddenly fell ill. She was diagnosed with meningitis. In an age before effective antibiotics, it was a death sentence for a child. Within days, surrounded by her heartbroken adoptive parents, Princess Johanna was dead. She was buried in the mausoleum at Rosenhohe alongside the parents and brothers she had never really known. With her death, the direct line of hereditary Grand Duke Georg Donatus of Hesse and by Rhine was completely and utterly extinguished. With the death of the little princess, the storybook tragedy was complete. But for the living, the grief was just beginning. Prince Louis and his new wife, Princess Margaret, were now the sole heirs to a title, a palace, and a legacy drenched in sorrow. They had planned for a wedding and a life surrounded by family. Instead, they became the custodians of a mausoleum. They would have no children of their own, and the silent halls of Wolfsgarten Palace served as a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the laughter that had been extinguished. They dedicated their lives to preserving the cultural heritage of Hesse, living quietly, forever defined by the loved ones they had lost in a single afternoon. The tragedy's impact also rippled outwards, landing with particular force on a 16-year-old schoolboy in Scotland, Cecilia's younger brother, Prince Philip. Cecilia was widely considered to be Philip's favorite sister. In a childhood marked by the exile of his father and the institutionalization of his mother, Cecilia and her husband Georg Donatus had provided one of the few stable, loving family environments he had ever known. The loss was profound. It is said that this unimaginable bereavement at such a formative age was a crucible that forged his famous stoicism and his unflinching sense of duty. The tragedy cast a long shadow over Philip's relationship with his German family, especially after World War II. When he married the future Queen Elizabeth II in 1947, in a Britain still recovering from the Blitz, none of his German relatives, including his surviving sisters, who had married Nazi officials, were invited to the wedding. It was a stark symbol of the divisions the war had wrought. Yet family ties, however strained, endured. Decades later, Prince Philip would make quiet pilgrimages to Darmstadt to visit the graves at the Rosenhohe, a silent acknowledgement of a private grief he carried throughout his public life. The Ostend disaster was not just a German royal tragedy. It was a foundational trauma in the life of the man who would stand beside the British monarch for over 70 years. The story of Georg Donatus and his family is more than just a family tragedy. It is a profound historical marker. The Ostend air crash symbolized, in the most brutal way imaginable, the end of an era. The old world of interconnected European royalty, already shattered by the First World War, was shown to be just as vulnerable as anyone else to the random, impersonal violence of a modern, technological accident. It was a stark prelude to the even greater horrors of the Second World War, which would kill millions and forever change the face of Europe. The tragedy is particularly resonant for the British royal family. Princess Cecilia was Prince Philip's favorite sister. His biographers note that this unimaginable loss at such a young age, losing his sister, his mentor-like brother-in-law, and his nephews all at once, profoundly impacted the young prince, shaping his famous stoicism and his deep understanding of life's fragility and the heavy weight of duty. The family's affiliation with the Nazi Party adds a layer of dark, tragic complexity. Their deaths occurred just 6 months after they had joined the party, placing their personal tragedy squarely within the context of Germany's larger moral catastrophe. They were a family caught between worlds, the old world of royalty and the new brutal world of fascism, and were ultimately consumed by a fate that seemed to transcend both. The story of hereditary Grand Duke Georg Donatus of Hesse is a truly profound and deeply sorrowful tale. It is a narrative not just of royal lineage, but of human vulnerability, of a beautiful love story, and of the crushing, indifferent power of fate. From the shadows of his father's early losses, Georg Donatus and his beloved Cecilia seem to have found a fragile peace, a sunlit island in a darkening world. Yet that peace was tragically and completely shattered in an instant, leaving only the echo of what might have been. Their lives ended not on a battlefield or by royal decree, but in the mundane horror of a modern accident. The curse of the House of Hesse, as some called it, seemed to find its brutal final expression in this catastrophic event, a chain of tragedy so complete it almost defies belief.